So the issue of student mental health and well-being is clearly a hot topic right now. We had a really good conversation about this recently with our university in-house advisors session. And I know that universities are really keen to support and help their students in this. Neil, could you explain a little bit more about the duty of care that universities owe their students?
Yeah, sure, of course. So this is, as you say, a really significant topic at the moment. Mental health in young people, in the whole population, but in young people in particular, is really difficult at the moment. We all know that lots of university students have had a really tough time in the last couple of years with the pandemic. And so the demand for mental health services has accelerated massively, and I think that will continue to be the case. But it does, of course, throw out difficult questions, because I suppose the worst case scenario, where a student is really struggling and it comes to some harm, or even in the absolute extreme case were to commit suicide, it would, of course, then lead to question of whether the university is responsible for that as a matter of law. The short answer is there's no case law on this at the moment to suggest that that would be the case. So you need to have, in order to establish negligence, you need to have a duty of care in the first place. So if you, for example, are just the average man in the street or woman in the street walking and you see someone that has an accident or needs help, you don't owe a positive duty of care to intervene, except for in some really unusual circumstances. So that's one extreme. But at the other extreme, something like the NHS would clearly owe a duty of care to any patient they come into, whether that's remotely or in person. So it's really finding the balance between those two extremes. And what the court will look at is what's called the proximity of relationship. So how close the relationship. Now, most university students are adults, so 18 over. And so the presumption is, well, they're able to be old enough to have their own responsibility for their own mental health. But the truth is that many of these people are often living away from home for the first time. They can be quite vulnerable. Some of them may come with pre-existing mental health problems, and some of them may have issues that develop along the way. And so whether a university has a positive duty of care to those people is a really difficult question that there's no obvious legal answer to. Even if they do have a duty of care, what a court would have to decide is whether that duty has been breached. In other words, whether there's been a failure by the education institution to provide the appropriate degree of support and care to the student. And then finally, whether that would have made a difference. That's causation, whether even if that support had been offered, whether that would have altered the outcome. So I think from where we are at the moment, it will be a challenging case for a student or their family to bring a successful claim in negligence against a university or college in those circumstances. But it's not impossible, and the way the law is going, it's probably a bit easier than it was a few years ago.
Okay, that's helpful. And what steps do you think universities should be taking to support their students in this?
Yeah. Okay, so the government is really keen, of course, and universities and colleges themselves will want to do this. They will want to provide the support for students. It is something that has really taken off exponentially over the last 10 or 15 years ago. Most colleges now, nearly all, I'm sure, will have a counselling service, support services, people who are not providing direct academic tuition to students, but are there as part of the support network. So yes, there is a need to do that. The only caveat with that is that the more support that you provide, as it were, the higher standards you're holding yourself up to be. So you're saying, we've got a counselling service. We may even have some mental health professionals in some universities are now coming into universities to provide that support. The more you offer, which is great, but the higher the standard that you'll be judged by. And so it is quite difficult in a way, standing back from it, to see why an NHS mental health nurse working in the community should owe a duty of care unquestioningly to a patient. And yet a very similar nurse, perhaps very similar experience, maybe not employed by the NHS, employed by a university, shouldn't owe a similar duty of care in a supported, say, campus environment. So I'm not saying that we're there yet, but I think there is that slightly two-edged sword. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that universities and colleges should pare down their services and provide less support. It's just that the more support you provide, the more likely it is that you're holding yourself out as having more expertise than you might have done 10 years ago.
Right, yeah, I understand. And there is a role in terms of the university speaking to the families of the students. Do they are they able to get involved, or if the university and the student are having that conversation, is there a responsibility to then speak to their parents about it?
Yeah, so that is a really difficult issue because, of course, when a child is going through the school system, they are a minor, they're not adults, and therefore the parents are automatically involved. As soon as the child hits 18, becomes an adult, that system changes. Okay, so there is no automatic right for parents to know and be involved. And in some situations, in fact, universities and colleges would be getting themselves into really hot water for doing that, because a student may actually have left a potentially very difficult, potentially even abusive home environment to go to university, and actually involving the family again may make things 10 times worse. There's also the question of consent. So you would be breaching a patient or the student's confidentiality if you were just to pick up the phone and say to mum, by the way, your son is really struggling, just to let you know we're providing support, but we thought you should know. That is a breach of that person's confidentiality. Now, having said that, there has been quite a lot of press about families, parents who have really only found out that their daughter or son has been in real difficulties and actually in extreme cases committed suicide. The first time they've really been aware of that is when the college ring up and say, I'm really sorry, but your son or daughter has died. The police tell them, and that is obviously going to be a massive shock and going to lead to a huge amount of questions. So it is a very difficult balancing act. So that I think that perhaps one of the ways that's being dealt with, because there's concerns about data protection law here, is an opt-in consent. And so as part of enrolment, asking students in the event of a difficult situation, are you happy for us to contact someone, and who is that someone? And then you've got the consent. And that's definitely the best way of dealing with it. You can't presume consent. It does create its own issues because then you've got a whole database of personal information, phone numbers, email addresses of people who are nothing to do with the university, but that's a different issue. But I think certainly that is something, it's a difficult issue. It's one that is not uniformly approached. There is no national approach to this. But I think I'm not a data protection specialist, but I think I accept that the difficulties that system in itself creates, but that does seem perhaps the best way from a medical legal way of dealing with it.
Okay, that's really helpful. And universities more and more are partnering with other organisations, outside the academic world, and also internationally. Sure. Do they have a responsibility when they're suggesting to students that they go and perhaps work in an organisation or go and study abroad? Do they have a responsibility to do some due diligence and check that that's going to be a safe environment? Yeah,
they do, in short. And so the courts have on occasions imposed, and in some cases actually imposed, really quite extreme responsibilities on universities. So if you're arranging for a student to go abroad, potentially to a dangerous country, for example, then yeah, absolutely, there would be that. Having said that, it is a matter of fact for each individual case. So, for example, if a student was in a year out in industry, went out and worked in a factory, and that factory on the face of it had all the certificates, all the necessary paperwork, looked very, reputable, well-known organisation, and yet despite all that something happened, an accident happened, then that may almost certainly would be that the university's responsibility would probably come to an end at the point they check out. On the face of it, this seems fine. There certainly wouldn't be an expectation that universities would be going out into those factories themselves and doing sort of equivalent of health and safety inspections. That would be going too far. But I think certainly making sure, reassuring themselves that this is a reputable place, this has got a good policies, procedures, and that kind of thing. I think that would, but that, accidents happen even in the best of circumstances, and so that wouldn't necessarily fall to the universities on the individual facts.
Fair enough. And finally, in the event that the university do have a student who's having some serious problems, what should the university be aware of? What steps should they be thinking about?
So there are a whole variety of issues, I suppose, that could arise. The most common everyone would think of is a claim. Living in an increasingly litigious society, people do tend to reach for the lawyer in terms of bringing a claim if something goes wrong, but also things like complaints, reputation. Social media nowadays, of course, is extremely difficult to manage, and firms and businesses can find themselves very quickly in very difficult, a whole whirlwind of negative publicity arising out of an incident. So the best way, I think, is certainly, obviously, always trying to prevent things is better than trying to deal with it afterwards. So making sure that you have got policies and procedures, and that people are familiar with those. So just to take the example of we've been talking about the mental health, there would be an expectation, I think, that everybody in the organisation, including the staff who work in a canteen, the security guards, etc., have got a really basic understanding of mental health issues, and they know where to recommend students to go, because one of the challenges is not everybody who's got a mental health problem is going to be reaching out and saying, please help me. Some of those might be really quiet, just suffering, but might on a late night, standing outside a room, engage in a conversation with a security guard who just happens to be on duty at that time. And actually that security guard then knowing what is available, and being able to say, have you thought about the student counselling or someone in the staff canteen? Again, those sort of things. So I think it's about making sure that you are that all the staff have got a broad knowledge, and also that you're able to deliver on what you is. There's no good having a really glossy brochure that you give to all students on enrolment saying we've got all these fantastic services if actually you haven't, or they're almost impossible to access. So I think how do you protect yourself? I think it's most obviously done through making sure you're doing what you say you're doing, making sure people are aware of that, and making sure that everybody in the organisation at least has a really fundamental grasp of how someone can be directed to help. So I think that is the sort of thing, practical things. As I say, prevention is always better if you can than trying to deal with it afterwards.
That's really great. That's really interesting. Thanks very much for your time, Neil.
No, that's fine. Thank you.